Hello guys, I've noticed a ton of you doing things that are really hurting your damage output in Diablo 4. Some of these things are costing you a ton of damage and laying a lot of damage on the table. I have 5 damage mistakes you're probably making right now, and although some of these you're probably definitely doing right, I know some of you are still definitely doing these wrong because I was doing them wrong for a long time. Now there's a ton of ways your damage manifests overall, generally in this attack power number, which kind of gives you an offensive stats, and it scales based off the weapons and certain stats on your weapons as well. Primarily it's going to be things like extra dexterity, extra strength, extra stats that go from your gear onto your character. So once you get those stats, and these stats are generally right here, it kind of scales that attack power number generally by itself, as well as DPS. Now that can be a little bit misrepresentative because a lot of the things that your weapons are going to have that are going to be of absolute crazy value to you damage wise are all the affixes. So there's certain specific drops that roll certain kinds of affixes. And what I mean by that is essentially before you worry about upgrading your gear, you should really pay attention to the weapon types that actually drop certain types of things. For instance, this crystal greatsword, I recently got a comment that somebody said I was married to this sword, and the answer is yes, I am married to it, and I finally found a better version of it, and I replaced it with the better version because all of them seem to roll exactly similar stats, and all 3 that I've found throughout this game so far have had all the same stat affixes on them, just different rolls. You can see it's critical strike damage, damage to slowed enemies, damage to crowd control, and close enemies, meaning I'm going to get all those huge percentages and damages. I mean, that's 40.5% critical strike damage, and then 37.5% critical strike damage on the same weapon. It's literally 78% critical strike damage. You can see my critical strike damage right here is 271% because a lot of these weapons stack that affix. Now, like I mentioned again, once you find a weapon that you really like the affixes of, pay attention, because if you find that weapon again, generally, you're going to get similar kinds of stats on it, and mostly the rolls will just be different. That's why I waited until I found another crystal greatsword and immediately replaced mine, because I was in love with how much damage the affixes were giving me. And then when I found a higher level weapon that gave me the same stuff, which was again the same exact type of weapon, the crystal greatsword, I then extracted and imprinted my aspect on this weapon, and all of a sudden, huge damage boost. So generally, certain types of weapons will have certain types of affixes by nature. So if you find a weapon you really like, keep an eye out for other weapons that are that type, because if you're looking to replace it, especially later in the game when equipment's a little more rare in terms of actually finding stuff to replace your gear with, generally that higher level gear that's the same type of gear can be easily used to replace your old gear. Now, one of the things I want to specifically go over first is upgrading weapons, because although people are upgrading weapons, there's kind of 2 different ways you should go about doing this. So originally at the beginning of the game, whether you're starting a new character or you're starting from scratch, you should at some point maybe think about upgrading your gear. And I say this for one specific reason. So initially when you start the game, you can start off by selling things to get a little bit of gold. And then once you start getting some gold, you can feel free every once in a while to just kind of, drop 3 points in terms of an upgrade on a piece of gear or weapon, because as a lot of you already know, if you get a weapon, even if I don't like this weapon, it costs nothing material wise hardly and nothing money wise to actually upgrade it. So you're getting a bunch of free points there. And keep in mind, as I've talked about in another video, the big thing with upgrading your weapons and armor, especially later on in the game, is you break certain breakpoints. Now I'm going to throw those up on the screen, and I mentioned it in a previous video, but those breakpoints give you a significant amount of additional power and bonuses. You can see here as an example in one of my one-handed swords, the actual bonuses I'm going to get for this are going to be pretty significant. Critical strike damage 8.3%. 9.6%, 8.3% down at the bottom. They're pretty big buffs. And the reason for this is a 706 plus 15 item power currently, meaning it's 721. And then if I add 5 to it, it's going to go to 726. There's a breakpoint at 725, meaning if you get your weapon over that 725 hump, it's going to take it from giving it, let's say, 1% or 2% critical strike damage bonus up to that next tier of gear, and instead it's going to give you probably like 4 times the extra bonus for the stat or the roll. And now generally one thing to keep in mind, although it doesn't necessarily matter, is the actual percentages on the bottom of these stats. When you upgrade this, it does re-roll the stat. So you can see the current percentage for damage to bleeding enemies is 6.5% to 13%. When we actually upgrade this, it's going to re-roll under the new percentage. You can see the new percentage to damage to bleeding enemies is going to be 9.8 to 19.6%. Now we're going to get a much bigger range that we can actually roll, and for the most part, about 75% of the time, we're going to roll and get a positive benefit out of it. You can see if we do roll the lowest amount here for bleeding enemy damage, it could be 9.8%. and the max for our current one could be 13%. So let's say it was 13%. If we don't want to chance having a lower roll, or we're perfectly fine and we don't want to worry about upgrading this piece, just keep that in mind that these numbers do re-roll and that can happen. But for the most part, the re-roll numbers are so much bigger and so much increased when you do actually pass that breakpoint. Generally, it's completely worth it. Levels 1 to 50, you can upgrade gear if you want. Generally, I wouldn't really recommend it because it's not really worth it in my personal opinion. But if you're talking about just putting 3 points in each thing that you upgrade early on, that's perfectly fine because it's cheap and effective to do so. I wouldn't go ahead and drop 4 or 5 upgrades on a piece of gear because then you start getting into wanting rare crafting materials, etc., which you're going to want later in the game because you're going to be doing a lot of that actual upgrading of gear, and you want all the materials for that you can get. And then once you get past level 50, every single time you replace a new piece of gear, you should upgrade it to 3. If I see any of you past level like 60 and you're just wearing gear and not upgrading it, we're gonna have a problem because you get a bunch of free stats, and a lot of the times you'll blow past breakpoints with these items automatically just by upgrading them 3. You can see this is a 713 plus 15. That means we're going to be at a 728 item power. Just by upgrading it 3, we passed that breakpoint and we got a lot of extra skills from it. So make sure you're always doing at least 3. And then it's also not expensive to do 4. So if you get to your weapons specifically, because they're your big damage dealers, feel free to upgrade those to max almost every time, or at least 4, so you can get the most DPS you possibly can. Now next is something I'm definitely going to touch on again because a lot of people I think are still having problems with this. They're still not doing it, especially when they're higher level, and it's actually starting out pretty cheap, so you can usually always afford to do this once at least. So when you start getting items, especially higher level, once you're lower level, I really wouldn't recommend doing this just because it's not worth it for the amount of materials you have to use. Once you get past 50, you can start enchanting. And what this is doing is replacing an affix on a piece of gear. So let's say you finally get a good piece of gear. Like, let's say these boots are stuck at level 50, and I finally get a 67 level piece that I really like, but one of the affixes is just dog water, and I don't like it. For instance, for this amulet, we don't need +1 rank of all weapon mastery skills. So really it's serving us no purpose. And right now, late game, this is essentially 1 or 2 item sales for me. It's 106,000 gold. That's easy enough to recoup, as well as the materials. And let's just say this aspect is a god roll and I just don't want to get rid of it. We're going to want to go on here and make sure our affixes are proper. Now, one thing about these affixes is you can only pick one of these to change. And once you pick it, that's the one you have to pick. And then you can re-roll that affix basically as many times as you want. But make sure you pick the affix that is least likely to be useful to you, because that's going to be the only one you're able to re-roll once you do so. So since we don't really need this, I'm going to go ahead and re-roll it. And generally, for the most part, you're going to get stuff that's actually pretty beneficial to you. So 4.5% physical damage over time. Automatically, that is a decent affix for me, and that's better than the last one. So we're going to go ahead and replace that. And again, you can do this with a lot of different items, because more than likely, most of these items you get are going to have one affix that's just completely useless. You can actually turn that in your favor by upgrading it and enchanting it. Now, you can see once you enchant this piece once, it starts getting very expensive. You might have to spend a bunch of gold to get good rolls, but until you're like max level, you can essentially just enchant one time since it's cheap enough, and then kind of roll with what you got. Now, one important thing to watch out for when rolling items and enchanting them is your gloves. Now, some people know this and some people don't. Right now, your gloves are primary items to give you ranks to your skills. And what I mean by that is you can see this glove individually gives me +2 ranks to Hammer the Ancients and +2 ranks of Whirlwind. Now this is big because especially later on, your ancient gear can give you sometimes 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 bonuses to your skills. And this is huge, especially if you have a build that, for instance, uses 1 or 2 specific skills to do a lot of damage. And your gauntlets primarily roll skills that are on your core skills section of your skill tree. So you can see I have 2 bonus to Whirlwind and 2 bonus extra Hammer the Ancients. Right now, our minimum damage for Whirlwind is 2,320. Keep in mind with this Whirlwind build, we're hitting each enemy at least like twice per second generally, if not sometimes 3 times. So that is a big number because we're going to hit an enemy probably 30 times in the course of 10 seconds. So even 100 damage there would add up pretty drastically. Now let's take off our gloves, and you can see just 2 additional points in Whirlwind brings that damage down to 2,037. We're missing out on like 300 damage here. And if you hit 30 times and then 300 damage, that's 9,000 damage over 10 seconds. At a minimum, that's not even if you get the max hit on your whirlwind or critical strikes, because those numbers kind of multiply based off this base damage. You can see that almost makes up for every other stat. So early on or later in the game, once you get plus ranks to your actual skill rankings, those are going to do so much more damage than almost all the other stats you can possibly get on your gloves. If you get those and those ranks match your primary skill, I don't care what you do. If it has a great aspect, take it off, put it on your new gloves, because that gives you the best possible damage basically that you can get. And like I said, ancestral gear later on will give you huge pluses to your ranks of gear, which really just sends your damage out of the park. And for instance, if we get a pair of gloves and we find that they just have ranks of Hammer of the Ancients and we want Whirlwind on it, we can take a chance and enchant them to try and get our actual skill rank off of that by just doing enchanting. You see it only costs 56,000 gold. And once I actually do this, here I didn't get that number, but I don't need this. And this gives me a 4.5% critical strike chance, which is great. I mean, I'll take that because that's amazing. But you can get replacements for those skill rankings here, which is the biggest point of damage. So make sure you're enchanting your gear, especially after 50, at least one thing per important piece, so that way you can get all the bonuses you need on your road to doubling your damage. The next big thing is applying vulnerable damage. Now, vulnerable damage is extremely important because, as you can see here, it has a base value of 20%, but your other items that you have on can give you additional benefits to that. Now, the big thing with vulnerable damage is it automatically, if you hit a vulnerable enemy, they take 20% additional damage. And that is automatically by default. This is why you see a lot of builds attempting to make enemies vulnerable, because they take a considerable amount of extra damage when they're vulnerable. And over time, that multiplies to be a pretty huge number that you can start hitting on vulnerable enemies. And like I mentioned, your gear can actually have vulnerable damage buffs on it. So you can see this specific ring right here, it gives me plus 11% vulnerable damage, and you can re-roll some of these stats on these weapons to actually roll vulnerable damage on them. And the more vulnerable damage you have can significantly increase the amount of damage you do. Now you can see mine is pretty low. It's actually just 36% right now, but there are some people that have theirs over 100% into the 130%, and that can lead to doing not only just double the damage, but sometimes triple and quadruple the damage. There are a lot of skills in the skill trees for basically all classes that give you chances to make enemies vulnerable and do that vulnerable damage to enemies, especially early on, even levels 1 through 50, but especially after levels 50 through 100, when you have all your skill points and you can start maxing things out. So you can see, as an example for the Barbarian, we have the pressure point passive, meaning your core skills give you up to a 30% chance to make enemies vulnerable for 2 seconds. This means every 1 out of 3 hits I do on an enemy, I basically have the chance to make them vulnerable. And with this Whirlwind build, we're hitting them non-stop all the time, basically guaranteeing we make an enemy vulnerable. Now, once you get past level 50, there's essentially a key to this, and that's what I'm going to show you right now. So make sure you stack on your vulnerable damage on your gear, but your Paragon board is the primary place that you're just going to boost your damage into outer space. And I'll go over the vulnerable portion as well as the rest of it and make it pretty self-explanatory in case you've never messed with this, because let's be honest, it's kind of a complicated system when you first look at it. So essentially the way the Paragon board works is it gives you your first tile, and it essentially has all these little areas in it. Now, you can put a point anywhere you want once you get a Paragon point, and essentially go up the map and over to the next Paragon board, etc., and just go between them all and collect all of these individual nodes. And most of them give you different bonuses, but like I said, they'll give you all kinds of bonuses. Certain nodes will give you big physical damage bonuses, certain nodes will just give you little strength pluses. But the primary thing here is you want to take a route to a glyph spot. Every single board you have, you can see, is going to have a singular glyph spot. And this is important because the glyph spots are your primary power spots. These are the spots that give you the most power to your character by far. So regardless of how good these nodes are, you want to make sure your glyphs are taken care of. And one glyph that every single class should have, because this is like one of the best glyphs in the game, is your exploit glyph. Now, your exploit glyph makes it so that when an enemy is damaged by you, meaning you hit an enemy once and damage them, they become vulnerable for 3 seconds, meaning for that 3 seconds, they're taking all of your vulnerable damage and that extra 20% base damage all at a time. And you literally just make them vulnerable by hitting them once. So it takes vulnerable out of the equation, immediately applies it to enemies, and gives you huge damage buffs this way. If you're levels 50 to 60 and you haven't really thought this out yet or started working on this, this is what I would start working on, because the second I actually put this glyph in this glyph socket and met the requirements at the bottom, my damage started going through the roof. And you can see at the bottom it has requirements, plus 27 out of plus 25 dexterity. What that means is you need at least plus 25 dexterity in the red area around this node. You can see once I take this glyph out of the socket, essentially what that means is you can see it's no longer in the socket, so there's no red area. And then when you put it back in the socket, what that means is that requirement at the bottom of plus 25 dexterity, that means you need to select and actually acquire nodes that will give you in total plus 25 dexterity or over to meet the requirements for this. You can see it says purchased in radius range. That is this red range. You can see we purchased dexterity right here for 5, 10, 15, 20 here, and then 27 right here. So since we did that, we met the requirements and we get this glyph bonus. Now this is a little bit difficult and you do have to pay attention to what board you put this in, because if we put this glyph in this socket right here, there aren't necessarily enough dexterity nodes to actually meet that requirement. So we wouldn't get the bonus for quite a little bit until we can expand the range. So you need to pay attention and make sure you can actually get the requirement bonuses. In worst case scenario, you can just take the glyph out like I did for free and put it back in somewhere else and just kind of experiment. And additionally, when you do a nightmare dungeon, you level up your glyphs with that experience at the end of that dungeon. So that's how you can level these glyphs up. So you can see hovering over this glyph is level 1. This glyph I have up here is level 7. Essentially, these glyphs get additional bonuses basically up to level 5, and these are just stat bonuses that increase the actual stats of the glyph. Now once you get to level 5, the big thing is getting your glyph to level 15, and once you get the glyph to level 15, essentially the radius expands, and this red area that is right here expands a couple slots outward, making the other slots red, giving you a much bigger range and higher power out of your glyph. Make sure you have the exploit glyph immediately socketed as soon as possible so you can get the vulnerable damage bonuses as quickly as possible, and then make sure you pay attention to the rest of the glyphs as you do them so that way you can get the biggest benefits, because like I said, they are one of your greatest power increasers as you start going and moving throughout the game. So while doing them necessarily perfect or right isn't a big deal, as long as you use your glyphs and get them activated that are best suited to you. Now another big thing I'm going to touch on quickly is aspects. Now you guys by now already know the whole aspect spiel, but one thing people I think constantly forget about their aspects, and I even forget about my aspects sometimes, is that certain spots actually give you additional bonuses. Now early level 1 through 50, you can stick to probably 3 main aspects. So pick 3 aspects that actually help your build the most, and then apply those to your gear. Levels 1 through 50, that gives you a huge bonus, and it doesn't cost hardly anything to do early in terms of materials or gold. Now don't go wasting all your materials, but it gives you a huge boost to get through the beginning levels of the game, whether you're on an alt character or a brand new character starting from scratch. And for anybody that says that is a waste of materials and stuff, it's a game about having fun, so you should upgrade early. So while I don't necessarily agree with upgrading your gear early, but I think applying aspects early to your gear, especially 3 primary ones that really synchronize with your build, can double your attack power, so it's totally worth it to do it early. Once you get later in the game, especially after level 50, you do want to try and get an aspect on all of your pieces of gear, just because it gives you a lot of extra benefits and added damage. And whether you're level 1 or level 50 or level 100, the big thing here is making sure you have your big abilities on 2 pieces of gear. Now, if you look at these aspects, keep this in mind because a lot of people are still messing this up. That your 2-handed weapon gives you a 100% power increase, meaning that whirlwind critical strike chance is 7% and it can be channeled up to 21%. Now, that 100% increase is going to give us double the power and double the percentage. You can see I have this same aspect on my weapon right here, and it doubles from that 21% you see here to 42% that is on this 2-handed sword. Whether it's this aspect or whether it's, let's say, this one or any other one that you have that can go on a 2-handed weapon, you should always put it on there because it deals 100% more damage and gives you 100% or double the effect that putting it on any other piece of gear would have had. So make sure your most powerful one, especially DPS wise, goes on this item and not, let's say, on your boots, because you're missing out on double the actual ability. So don't do that. Additionally, if you're a barbarian like myself, you have 2 2-handed weapons. So this can make a big difference because you can essentially put 2 powerful aspects on both of these and get the benefits from both. And then make sure whether it's your second or third most powerful aspect where you want the biggest bonus percent increase on your amulet. And this is because your amulet, as you can see, also gives you a 50% power increase. So it takes it from 100% power to 150% power. So some people are just throwing aspects on this gear. Make sure when you get your second most prioritized one that you put it on your amulet, so that way it goes up 50%. It's a free 50% to your second most important imprint that you need to do. So make sure you're not missing out on the bonuses of having aspects on your 2-handed weapons and your amulet, because they give you huge damage bonuses and huge damage increases. And the final thing I want to go over is something that I know some of you are definitely missing out on and not even realizing it. And it does have to do with gems. Now, the first thing I'm going to mention before what I think you're actually missing, because I was actually missing this up until today. But before that, I want to go over the fact that gems should be slotted every single spot that you have open in your gear. So every single spot that you have open, whether you're level 1, level 2, level 3, or level 50, or again, level 75 or 100. From the beginning of the game, from the beginning you start this game, the second you have a piece of gear that you can slot something in that's useful to you, you should immediately slot it in. Now, every single piece of gear that has an empty socket should have a gem in it because it gives you huge bonuses. I mean, you can see this weapon right here gives me plus 9% critical strike damage. I have 2 in here, 1 in here, 2 in here. We literally get 50% extra critical strike damage to vulnerable enemies. And just because I decided I want to just put my gems in here and let them chill out for a little bit, I have 50% extra damage to critical strike. 50%, right? Like 50% extra damage. Like, that's a huge deal just because I decided that I want to drop these gems in here. And it hurts absolutely nothing. So you need to find gems that you need and apply them in your weapons. And one of the great things about this is it doesn't matter if you slot gems in your weapons or your armor, and I said this kind of in a previous video, but even if you do that, the only time you're going to take this out is if you want to replace this gear, and you don't have to worry about taking this, you know, to the jeweler and extracting it and doing all that over and over and over. When you're replacing gear, you want to get the gem out. It's as simple as that. And all you have to do is normally salvage this gear. You can see my 5 emeralds here. Let's say I'm trying to replace this gear, which is why I would take it off and want the gem out of it. All you have to do is salvage it and you get the gem back for free. You need to go ahead and put gems in your stuff because otherwise you're wasting a lot of potential power and a lot of potential damage. Additionally, as you're leveling up, it's so cheap to do. And you can see right here, I'm a perfect victim of it myself, is having weapons that don't have a slot. If you have weapons that give you such big benefits like these, or pieces of armor, for instance, that you want to put gems in, it's so cheap, especially when you're later in the game, to just go ahead and go in here and add a socket to that item. You have materials here just to add sockets to items that you're never going to use if you don't do this. And so you should, when you get decent pieces of gear, add sockets to them. It's only 100,000 gold, so you can throw a gem in here and then you get the huge benefit from it, and it only costs you literally a small amount of gold. Like, and the final thing around gems that I know you've been messing up on, and I know you've been messing up on it because I just messed up on it myself, so some of you out there are doing this, I can't be the only one, is your actual gem quality. So when you get earlier in the game, you start finding better and better gems, meaning you get the triangle ones instead of the chipped ones or the round ones, etc. But eventually, you can see I'm level 62. I have just gotten these over and over and over again, and I don't actually know if these square ones drop by themselves. I'm assuming at some point they might, but from level 50 to 62, I've found none of these, and I've only found the triangle ones, but these square ones give you a decently bigger bonus. The one thing you're going to want to make sure you do, especially once you get a higher level, is go in here to the jeweler and actually upgrade these, because I don't think you had this option earlier on in the game, but once you start getting high enough level, you have the option to actually create and craft these. You need to make sure you're picking these up and actually going in here and crafting these, because again, these are so much better. So now I'm going to have to pull these gems out of mine to put these in place of it, because these give you a much bigger bonus. That being said, those are a lot of the big mistakes you're making that are costing you a lot of damage. But once you start getting some of that stuff in line and in order, you're going to start seeing your damage jump up from decent numbers to pretty huge numbers just by doing a lot of the things I talked about here. That being said, if you guys liked the video, make sure to drop a like on the video, subscribe if you're new, check the video on the left or the right for more awesome Diablo content. That being said, thank you guys.